Oh, it's all yours, Leah. You're on mute.
And many times as I've done this, you would think that I would know how to unmute myself before starting a presentation. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. I was very excited to be asked to come and talk about the do's and don'ts of medical cannabis. So I'll go ahead and get started. I will have the chat up, but Gary has promised to just step in and interrupt me so that we can really have a conversation about medical cannabis or other questions that you have about this topic this morning. So let me go ahead and share. All right. Gary, can you let me know, are you guys seeing the
Yep.
presentation there?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. All right, so do's and don'ts of medical cannabis. I'm going to quickly give just a little bit of historical background because I'm a bit of a history buff and you guys are a captive audience. So, like opium and opioids, which are the basis of the narcotic pain medications, cannabis has a very long history of use that dates back probably thousands of years. And it wasn't really introduced to the world of Western medicine until around the 19th century, primarily by a physician named William O'Shaughnessy, who was working in India. And cannabis was actually used pretty widely as a medical treatment, and it was included in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the USP, starting in 1851. However, in the early decades of the 20th century, there was concern about the non-medical use of cannabis or recreational use of cannabis that obscured its medicinal purpose, its industrial uses. And then cannabis was essentially prohibited in 1937 and then removed from the USP in 1942. THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the kind of psychoactive, intoxicating plant-based chemical in cannabis, was isolated in 1964 by researchers. And when researchers in kind of pharmaceutical research isolate this kind of chemical, they want to find out what it is in our bodies that makes it have an effect on us. Why does a plant have such a big effect on a human being? And so they looked for a receptor. And they identified this receptor not until 1990, which is now called the cannabinoid 1 receptor or the CB1 receptor. But in between that time, 1964 and 1990, cannabis was classified as a Schedule 1 substance by the Controlled Substances Act. That was in 1970. A Schedule 1 substance is one that is considered to have a high potential for abuse and no accepted medical use. And I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the regulation of cannabis a little bit later on. Um, and then in 1996, California became the first state to legalize medical cannabis. And since that time, we've really seen a snowball effect in the last few decades of other states decriminalizing or legalizing cannabis use in various ways. But right now, today, it still remains classified as a Schedule 1 drug. There was some real movement in 2023 when the Department of Health and Human Services sent a recommendation to the DEA to move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And I do see, before I move on, I see a question here in the chat about any thoughts about online ordering made legal by the 2018 Farm Bill. And I'll talk a little bit about hemp later on specifically, but briefly now, the 2018 Farm Bill, made hemp legal. Hemp is a term for cannabis strains that have very, very low concentrations of THC in them. But the intent of that bill, which was to, really to promote hemp for industrial uses, kind of spiraled when people began to synthesize intoxicating cannabinoids from hemp and then sell them through basically a loophole in the Farm Bill, they could be sold. So I'll get a little bit more into that later on because actually that has now is about to change too, the definition of hemp. And so that's going to change in the future. So, good kind of segue into cannabis terminology. So, the reason I use the word cannabis is that this is the scientific name of the plant. There are classic varieties, some terms that you may have heard include cannabis sativa, cannabis indica, and at one point there were morphological characteristics in the shape of the plant and the leaves. It's what you're seeing in on the slide here that distinguish the two varieties. And there are some claims, if you walk into any dispensary, you will probably see evidence of these claims that, sativa is a stimulant and it's energizing and indica is relaxing and sedating. But over the last several decades or more, there's been so much crossbreeding that pretty much all cannabis grown today is some kind of hybrid, and those classifications don't really apply to cannabis grown today. And as far as I'm aware, there's never really been any evidence that those classifications have any pharmacological basis. And then marijuana, of course, is also another term for cannabis. It originated in Mexico and it was popularized in the early 20th century. As a way really to distance cannabis from its medicinal and industrial uses and create some pretty negative associations in order to gain support for, at the time, what was kind of anti-cannabis legislation. In popular culture in America, that word had some racist connotations because there was a lot of concern about large-scale immigration from Mexico. And today, of course, the words cannabis and the word marijuana are used interchangeably, but I'm going to use the word cannabis from here on out in this presentation. All right. So I'm so deeply sorry. I don't think any of you probably thought you were going to be getting a chemistry lesson this morning, but when you invite a pharmacist to give a presentation, sometimes that's what happens. So phytocannabinoids are compounds that are specific to the cannabis plant. And there are over 100 of them that are known to us. Delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and cannabidiol, or CBD, are the main cannabinoids of interest. And as an aside, I think it's kind of interesting, again, to consider like why would a plant make a compound that affects human or animal physiology? What is the natural basis for that? I figure it's either got to be for defense, like maybe the animals eat the cannabis plant and then they fall asleep and they stop eating it. Or maybe it's for propagation. The animals eat it and then they spread the seeds. We really don't know the exact reason why cannabis makes these compounds because they're actually not necessary for the survival of the cannabis plant. Anyway, that was a bit of an aside. So what you're looking at here is the chemical structure of delta 9 THC. And the reason that it's called delta 9 THC is because of this position of this carbon-carbon double bond. That's the kind of second line inside the ring there. And that's just a chemist thing. The naming is not, particularly important. But what I want to ask is if you compare the structure of delta 9 THC with the one right below it, do you think that these are the same molecule? What do you guys think? Do you think they're in the same molecule? Yes or no? You can put it in the chat or raise your hand. I can kind of see who thinks that yes, they're the same. See, I'm seeing a lot of no's in the chat. Thank you guys for participating. So on the bottom, it is still THC. But that double bond has been shifted one position, which now in the 8th position. And now it's a different molecule. It's a THC isomer that is called delta 8 THC. And that'll come into play a little bit later when I start talking about hemp and the hemp-based cannabis products and the things that you're probably seeing if you go into pretty much, any gas station, you can see delta 8 THC products. And then finally, on the right is CBD. Now, CBD actually looks pretty similar to THC, but it's got one major difference from a pharmacology standpoint. And that is that CBD has this open six-membered ring, whereas the ring and THC is closed. And that's just one small difference, but it drastically changes the pharmacology of CBD, meaning that it has much different effects on the human body than THC does. Just one little chemical difference. So once these cannabis compounds, cannabinoids, actually get into the body, how do they have the effect that they actually have? That they have an effect because we have an endocannabinoid system, or ECS. And the endocannabinoid system consists of the cannabinoid receptors, like the CB1 receptor that was discovered in 1990, but of course we've always had it. And also our endogenous cannabinoids called endocannabinoids. These are compounds that are very similar to THC, but we generate them ourselves. That's why we have these receptors. And then there are other compounds that we have for creating these endocannabinoids, and for metabolizing them. The ECS actually exists in all animal species. It's involved in multiple regulatory and protective functions like hunger and feeding and energy metabolism, neuroprotection, pain, mood, immune response. And this can be modulated by diet, sleep, exercise, stress, and other factors, including, exposure to cannabis or phytocannabinoids. So our endogenous endocannabinoids are anandamide and 2-AG. They are neurotransmitters, which means they are chemicals that act on our brain cells. And when they act on cannabinoid receptors, they affect the release of other transmitters like dopamine, potentially like serotonin. And there are two types of cannabinoid receptors. We call them cannabinoid 1, CB1, or CB2. And the cannabinoid receptors aren't just located in the brain, although that seems to be where most of the CB1 receptors are concentrated, but they're located all over the body. And when either our own cannabinoids, or endocannabinoids, or plant-based cannabinoids activate those receptors or interact with them in some way, they produce some kind of response in that organ or tissue. The CB2 receptors seem to be present primarily in the immune system, but in other tissues as well. And there may be a lot of other types of receptors that are associated with activity in the ECS, but there's a lot that we still don't know. For a biological system that has been part of our physiology for so long, I can tell you that most medical schools, pharmacy schools, and other health professions programs don't teach about the ECS. So now that you've got this foundation in kind of the pharmacology of cannabis, I want to summarize what we know about the therapeutic uses of cannabis. And because I forgot to give you a little background about myself, even though Gary told me to do that at the beginning. So I'm a pharmacist. I am a professor at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. I'm a clinical pharmacist by training, and my clinical specialty is pain management and palliative care. Palliative care is the care of patients with advanced complex or terminal illness. And so that is sort of how I became interested or started to gain some knowledge about the medical use of cannabis. Even before medical cannabis was legalized in Maryland, when I was doing my residency training and I was working with a lot of hospice patients and a lot of hospice teams, as well as working with patients in the hospital, I would occasionally get questions usually from family members or caregivers or sometimes patients about using cannabis to treat certain symptoms. So I became familiar with some of the evidence that existed on the subject then, but of course at that time, really there was not a lot that we could tell them in terms of obtaining it. for medical use. And then back in 2017, the dean of the pharmacy school wanted to create a master's program in medical cannabis science and therapeutics because of the really rapidly expanding medical cannabis industry, and the lack of formalized training in really any higher education program. And certainly at that time there wasn't a lot of formalized training in health professions programs in particular. And so I hoped I might be able to teach a course in that program. I was fairly junior faculty at the time. And I shared some of my ideas with the dean, and essentially I ended up being given the opportunity to design and develop and implement the program as its first program director. So we have at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy our Graduate Studies in Medical Cannabis program, which we launched in 2019. We have, I think, about 800 graduates of the program now. And so that's sort of how I became, really engaged in this field and in although we don't do research on products at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. We're a public institution, and but we do a fair amount of observational research, and certainly I'm aware of a lot of the research out there. So a little bit of a detour, but that's sort of the basis for where I kind of come by my interest and experience in this field. So the evidence for therapeutic cannabis use. It's actually fairly challenging to interpret the existing research and apply it to practice in the field for a few reasons. First, clinical research in the field of medical cannabis might involve a standardized pharmaceutical agent. We actually do have FDA approved synthetic cannabinoids. One is called dronabinol, one is called nabilone, another is called nabiximols, although that's not available in the US, and then CBD oil most recently. So those are standardized pharmaceutical agents. Or a clinical trial could involve a non-standardized agent that could be the whole plant. It could be an extract. It could be some other formulation like a gummy or, a concentrate. And the products that are available to patients, like at the point of sale, differ from state to state because, of course, we don't have a standardized cannabis industry. So the agent in any given clinical trial that is being evaluated might not exactly or even closely resemble the products that patient could find in a dispensary. And then finally, because of the Schedule I status of cannabis, a physician cannot prescribe a specific dose or product or concentration or formulation, even if they had the evidence and the knowledge to do that. Now, in states where cannabis is legal, where medical cannabis is legal, a physician can recommend cannabis. And the First Amendment, protects a physician from talking about cannabis with patients. But physician can recommend cannabis in a state where it's legal. But for instance, let's say a physician recommended a specific product or, a specific type of product to a patient, and the patient went into a dispensary. The dispensary isn't legally bound to give that specific product or formulation. It's not like if you get a prescription for insulin and you take it to a pharmacy, the pharmacist can't say, oh, you know what? We don't have insulin in today, but we have metformin, and that is almost just as good. So I'm going to give you that. They can't, obviously we can't do that in the pharmacy, but they can, a dispensary can do that because there's no legal prescription for a cannabis product. You can't write a prescription for a Schedule I substance. So except for the few pharmaceutical agents that are available, there's a lot of extrapolation that has to occur from the studies. So essentially, we can say that there's the potential for the benefit of cannabinoids for a certain condition, like chronic pain, let's say, but not likely for the specific product that the patient will be using. And that's really very different from how we typically do Western medicine, which is, it's a pretty regimented pipeline from, pharmaceutical development, to clinical trials, phase one, phase two, phase three, FDA approval, post-marketing research. So it's really a very different scene. And I see a question in the chat, which is what form is cannabis dispensed to the patient? And so the way it's different in the specifics are different in states, but typically what happens is um, an individual who is interested in using, medical cannabis will go see a physician who will certify that that patient is eligible, you know, to use medical cannabis under whatever the laws are in the state, and they vary from state to state. That individual then typically will register with whatever the regulatory body is in the state, and they'll get some sort of registration card and ID card or something similar. But then with that, they can go into any dispensary and buy any product that they want. And so those products can be, the whole plant formulation, it can be gummies or other edibles or whatever is available in the dispensary. So, the medical part of medical cannabis products is really a regulatory designation because there's no real restrictions. Once are registered, then you can kind of go in and buy, whatever product is available or that you want. And that's one of the reasons that I think it's very important that individuals who are working at dispensaries have some kind of training to be able to speak knowledgeably about these products. So here's the, very quick evidence base for cannabis therapeutics. We have good evidence that cannabis-based medicine is good for chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, for some severe forms of epilepsy. Really good evidence that it is helpful in chronic pain and spasticity from MS. Fair amount of evidence in favor of its benefits for insomnia, and then limited evidence or no evidence for pretty much everything else. And if you are interested in kind of looking at where this evidence base comes from, there's an aging, but I think still quite relevant systematic review that was published by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that is available for free online. And they have a very comprehensive publication kind of summarizing all of this evidence. Now, you may be aware that, well, as I said before, we'll say a few more times, right? Cannabis is a Schedule I drug. So that means that according to the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, it has no accepted medical use. And honestly, I could do a whole session just on the history of cannabis regulation in the US. But for now, I'll just say that the designation has been unsuccessfully challenged. The Schedule I designation has been unsuccessfully challenged about half a dozen times since 1970. And again, in 2023, HHS conducted some research before they made that recommendation to the DEA to reschedule it. They did a fair amount of research looking into all aspects of cannabis as it relates to scheduling, including patterns of use and evidence, and they determined and reported that cannabis actually does have some currently accepted medical uses, and they are listed on this slide. Pain, nausea and vomiting, and anorexia, which is a lack of appetite associated with a medical condition. And this is a really big deal because this means that cannabis does not fit the description of a Schedule I drug, which is something that those of us who are in this clinical space have, known for a long time. So trends in medical cannabis programs, kind of more recent trends. At the time of this publication, which was in 2022, 38 states plus DC had legalized medical cannabis use, and then 23 states at that time, it's now 24, I just heard about Virginia, had legalized adult non-medical or recreational use. And so what this study found, looking at trends in medical cannabis programs was that overall, the number of patients between 20 and 22 who were enrolled in medical cannabis programs decreased, but that enrollment actually declined in jurisdictions that legalized adult recreational use. And to me, this is a big deal. I saw this in Maryland too, because I think it's very important to still have a robust medical program that works for patients and protects patients, and gives information to patients, of course, and not all patients are adults or able to get out to a dispensary. But, the reality is that once adult non-medical use is legalized, people are no longer as interested in enrolling in a medical program. And we also find that the proportion of patient-reported qualifying conditions that have a high level of evidence have decreased a lot. And what that means is that every state designates with a medical program, a medical cannabis program, that has a list of what they call qualifying conditions, medical conditions, which if you have them, a doctor can certify that you are an appropriate patient for medical cannabis. Some states are very strict in their definition of a qualifying condition. Some are, very loose. It varies from state to state. But what we found, and then this is also borne out by this survey, is that chronic pain is the most common, one of the most common reasons that people seek out medical cannabis. Also anxiety, insomnia, and depression. And the major takeaway from this, for me, is that the reasons that individuals are seeking medical cannabis are not necessarily indications that have the best evidence base. And so as a clinician, I think, that's important to know, because you have to, especially in this sort of non-traditional clinical space, really have to meet people where they are. And again, this study, the mean age of someone who said that they used medical cannabis was 49. So this is not just young people who are using medical cannabis. Smoking and edible formulations were the most common methods of use. And I see a couple of questions here in the chat. One is, what is the status of medical cannabis use in Virginia? And I just read, thanks to Carolyn for letting me know before this happened, that right now, a bill passed that will allow adult non-medical use cannabis to be sold for adult non-medical use starting in January of 2027. That is a pretty big change for Virginia. Another question, does pain after knee replacement surgery qualify as chronic pain for a short time? Chronic pain is something that typically if you have pain after knee surgery and it goes away within a reasonable amount of time, I would not consider that to be chronic pain. If you have pain after knee surgery that lingers after a reasonable healing time, then I would consider that to be chronic pain. And then there's another question, is it legal for a Virginia resident to drive over to Maryland and purchase cannabis from a dispensary for personal use and drive it back into Virginia? And the answer to that is no. That if you live in a state where cannabis is legal, you can only buy the cannabis in that state according to those states' laws. So some considerations, some cautions and considerations, that cannabis is not for everyone. And when I think about the potential risks of cannabis use, I'm mostly referring to THC. This is the most commonly studied cannabinoid for both therapeutic uses and potential harms. So individuals who have severe complicated cardiovascular disease shouldn't use cannabis. Patients who are pregnant and breastfeeding shouldn't use cannabis. individuals with a history of some psychiatric conditions, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder should use caution. History of substance abuse, also caution. Individuals under the age of 25 really shouldn't be using cannabis because their brains and their endocannabinoid systems are still developing. And individuals with severe lung conditions shouldn't be using inhaled forms of cannabis. And natural isn't the same as safe. Even if we're thinking about, natural, plant-based, you're not going to use a gummy or some other artificial form of cannabis. But natural is not the same as safe. And because cannabis contains, compounds that have a pharmacological action on our bodies, there is the potential risk for things like drug interactions. There have been some drug interactions, particularly with blood thinners, that have been well documented about increasing the risk of a dangerous bleed. And some other interactions as well. If someone is taking a medication that has a tendency to cause sleepiness, and then they're using a THC containing compound, that could kind of have a synergistic effect. There are potential for drug interactions. And then, of course, cannabis is associated with a risk of addiction. It's not potentially as high a risk of addiction as some other compounds that are legal, like, nicotine, for instance, alcohol, or even some of the other other medications that are on a lower schedule, things like, oxycodone, for instance. But there is a risk. And that's why, especially individuals with a history of substance abuse should be really careful about using cannabis. All right, so I talked about THC and CBD being the primary cannabinoids that we think about. There are many others, but I like to compare THC and CBD. So THC is intoxicating. There are two FDA approved synthetic THC products that have actually been around since the 80s, dronabinol and nabilone. And the potential side effects include, again, intoxication, anxiety, rapid heart rate, dry mouth, and in very high doses, there's the risk for some very serious side effects, including acute psychosis. Now, CBD is not intoxicating. That's what makes it such an interesting target for therapy. There's one FDA-approved plant-based product. Brand name is Epidiolex. It's a CBD oil that is FDA approved for individuals with three different types of severe refractory seizure disorders that we primarily see in children. There are some potential side effects with CBD too. But both of these have potential medical uses. THC has potential medical uses as well for pain, for nausea and vomiting, for this anorexia or lack of appetite you can see with some severe medical conditions. And they both have the potential to interact with certain medications and medical conditions. Now,
How
before
well
we get,
can I
oh,
can I ask a question?
pop in,
You're
yeah.
talking about interactions with medications. How well versed are most doctors to the dangers of those interactions? Are they aware of it, or
I would say in general, and I'm speaking as a pharmacist here, I would say in general, doctors don't get a lot of training in this area. And I think that, pharmacists get a lot of training in drug interactions and the potential for what we call pharmacokinetic interactions. A lot of these are hypothetical. We know that both CBD and THC are metabolized in the liver, like many, many other drugs. And so when you take drugs that interact, taking one can increase the concentration of another or decrease the concentration of another, making it more likely to have side effects or less likely that it will be effective. And so, pharmacists are the ones I think who have specific training in how to identify drug interactions. Although specifically with cannabis, training in pharmacy programs, although increasing in both pharmacy and medical programs, it's still is not um, I would say a standard part of the pharmacy school curricula.
Got a comment here that somebody used AI to get its take on interaction with other drugs. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that it's great to use AI to get an idea, but I would always verify those things with your pharmacist. But I do think using AI to start a conversation or to give you, make you feel comfortable and knowledgeable and having a conversation with your pharmacist is fine. But I would not use AI, to replace, medical advice from, your pharmacist or your doctor. Um, and then I see a question about the latest research on psilocybin. Psilocybin is a psychedelic, a psychedelic compound. We usually see it in mushrooms. I have a colleague actually who is chairing a task force in Maryland that is looking at psychedelics and the clinical uses of psychedelic medicine. There's increasing, data on the use of psilocybin and other psychedelic medications, particularly in psychiatric conditions, something called psychedelic assisted therapy. I'm not an expert in that area, but I know that in general, psychedelic medicine is starting to get a lot of attention from the medical field and in medical research. So some of
And we
these,
have one
go
more
ahead.
question.
Yeah.
What does the research show about the use of gummies for insomnia?
Yeah, there's a fair amount of research, I would say a moderate amount of research that supports the use of cannabis-based medicines to treat insomnia. Gummies, gummy is just a vehicle. So when I think about like what the research shows, I think more about the compound itself. But yes, there is some, moderate evidence that supports the use of THC, and there's also evidence supporting the use of CBD. So either one in insomnia. I think it's always best to um, if you're thinking about using, a cannabis-based product, starting with CBD because it is not intoxicating, is sort of the safest place to consider, after, you've had a conversation with doctor about potential for interactions with medications or medical conditions. So just briefly on side effects, again, I'm talking mostly about THC here. We had a little discussion before we got started about the increasing concentrations of THC in cannabis products. And that is something that's been happening over the last few decades. Back in the 80s, cannabis was probably 5% THC. Now, mainly because of these better industrial growing conditions, the cannabis plant itself is going to have closer to 30% THC. And there are products that, things like concentrates and oils that can have upwards of 90% THC. And it's these products that we tend to see having some serious acute adverse events like acute psychosis, or if used too much, we can see a cyclic vomiting syndrome. Again, just kind of driving it home that there are risks associated with this, especially today because cannabis is not the same as it was. Now, kind of to move on to talk a little bit about regulation in the U.S. So as I said, still for now a Schedule 1 drug. That puts it in the same class of substances as heroin, LSD, MDMA or ecstasy. And the main thing that, again, differentiates this from other compounds that are not as highly scheduled is that apparently it has no currently accepted medical use. If you look at Schedule 2, which is supposed to have still a high risk of abuse, but a currently accepted medical use. That schedule includes things like cocaine, oxycodone, morphine. So we're saying that, by cannabis being in Schedule 1 really does not fit there anymore. Cannabis right now is still federally illegal. The states create their own laws regarding its use. Here, this is a graphic of um, different states and different programs that they have. The green is adult and medical use, and there's very few states there in white that have no cannabis access at all. Many states have just CBD or low THC, so these are less likely to be intoxicating. And then several have, just a medical program. So things are rapidly changing in the US. Now, I told you I would kind of come back to THC a little bit because there was that great question at the beginning of the session. Hemp is the word for cannabis. It's the same plant. It's a cannabis plant, but it contains very, very low levels of THC, less than 0.3% THC. And historically, this is grown for industrial uses. And in 2018, the Farm Bill removed hemp from the definition of marijuana, which is how it is designated in the Controlled Substances Act, so that hemp became legal. And that meant that farmers could grow it. The intention was that it would be used industrially. The definition again changed in 2025. But think about, because of the Farm Bill, this led to an overproduction of hemp. And so, what happens when you overproduce a commodity? You can yell it out or put it in the chat.
Well, the price tends to fall.
Exactly. Like the price drops. So then you have a lot of hemp farmers wondering how they can make money with all of this hemp that they are growing. And that is where you saw that burgeoning industry of hemp-based CBD and cannabis products, which, now you go into the grocery store, you go into, the pharmacy, the beauty supply store, you see lots of CBD products. And in addition to that, it was discovered that you could create intoxicating cannabinoids like delta 8 THC. Remember, that's THC with a double bond shifted one position to the left. Delta 8 is psychoactive, and it can be made from CBD, which is now legal according to the Farm Bill. And that's why you're seeing these Delta 8 THC products at gas stations and convenience stores as an alternative to Delta 9 THC. And then same thing, there's Delta 10. The problem is that Delta 8 exists in extremely minute quantities in the plant itself. So chemists have to do reactions on CBD to produce these different molecules, these isomers. They have to boil it in acid, and we don't know how these products are regulated and how they're purifying the products, because when you boil CBD in acid, you get a lot of byproducts. What are we doing with these byproducts? How are they cleaning it up? We just don't know. So from
Leah,
hemp,
just so you know, it's 10 minutes to 11. So
I'm almost
just
done.
a time check.
Thanks for letting me know, Gary. I'm wrapping it up. So that's one reason that now there is a new definition of hemp that excludes these products. So when that takes effect, it will kind of close this loophole where we can no longer have these types of products. And then just to wrap it up, I said, there's movement on federal cannabis regulation. So we may see that cannabis becomes a Schedule 3. So that may change things, especially as it relates to research. If you are interested in learning more, here are some good websites for you to check out. Also, I mentioned our Graduate Studies in Medical Cannabis program, which is another great source of information if you are interested. Because again, professor, and I'm almost done here. I like to provide a structure for evaluating resources online. This is called the TRAP method. It's a way to guide you to think critically about the information that you read online and decide whether it is appropriate to your needs, whether it can answer your questions, looking at when it was published, its relevance to your personal situation, who wrote it, do they have the authority to make claims that they're making, how confident are you in the accuracy of what's being written, and what's the purpose? Is it a scientific article? Is it on a commercial website? These are all things that can help you evaluate what you are seeing online. Aha, okay, there we go. Does it give you the information you need? Who wrote it? Are the facts verifiable? And when was it created? And then one more thing, how do I talk to my doctor about medical cannabis? Ask your doctor these questions. Does cannabis interact with my medical conditions? What are the potential benefits and harms? What evidence supports the use of cannabis? How do I know if it's working? What side effects are possible? And when should I seek medical attention? And that's all I have. So I'm going to stop sharing here.
Okay, we've got a question. Does Virginia have a limit on the percentage of THC in items that are available commercially?
That I don't know. I'm not an expert on Virginia's laws. I'm not sure if there's a limit on what is sold. I'm sorry, I can't answer that one.
Okay. What do I have to do to use cannabis for knee replacement pain?
I think the first thing would be talk to talk to your doctor to make sure that you are an appropriate candidate for cannabis. And then assuming for people who are appropriate candidates for cannabis and who have talked to their doctor about it, considering medications that you're taking and other medical conditions that you have, the general consideration is to start with a primarily CBD product because it's not going to be intoxicating. To start from there, and then if you need to, then potentially move to THC products. But it's really better to start with CBD products. And if you're at a dispensary, make sure that you understand the packaging. Ask someone to help you at the dispensary. This was something else that someone mentioned prior to the start. Sometimes, especially edibles, it can be hard to delineate a specific dose if you're getting like a whole brownie. It could actually contain, the whole thing could contain a much higher amount of cannabinoid than what is actually supposed to be the dose or amount that someone is supposed to eat in one sitting. So just be very aware of things like reading the labels, make sure that you understand the labels with help from someone at the dispensary, make sure that there's a safe place to keep this so that pets and children can't get to these products. I see another question here. Are topical CBD products worth considering? Are they really just a marketing gimmick and not really active? That's a fantastic question. And the answer is that we don't know because the products that are sold as like supplements in the grocery stores are not regulated by the FDA. So it's really not possible to say for sure, do they, one, do they contain what they say they contain? Two, they contain other things that they're not supposed to. For instance, higher THC concentrations than they're supposed to. Are they safe? This is, similar to, many of the kind of nutraceutical products that you might see. They're typically not highly regulated. In this case, they're not regulated at all by the FDA. So use with caution.
There's a question here about what's available at the dispensary on Wilson Boulevard. You probably don't have that information, but I thought that might be one to throw out to the whole audience for anybody that's actually been there. Nope, guess not.
Well, I can say, although I don't know about that dispensary, in general, you'll find a range of products available at dispensaries. You'll find, whole plant, that can be, you'll find, that in just the buds itself. You'll find pre-rolled joints. You'll also find gummies and edibles, and concentrates that could be, in oils or tinctures. You do not, there's really no such thing as a direct prescription for cannabis, but you may need to be part of, the medical program. Then you may need to go and be certified to use medical cannabis by a doctor and then register with the regulatory body in Virginia. So until January 2027, and then you can just walk in.
Now, there are also cannabis infused drinks being sold in, Total Wine and grocery
Yep.
stores and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about those?
So, anything that's sold in a place like Total Wine is a hemp-based product. Again, this is one of those kind of loopholes from the Farm Bill. So where they have, THC that they are extracting, from hemp, and that way it is legal. THC products, that aren't produced from hemp would have to be sold in a dispensary. Again, I would say it's sort of a buyer beware because it's hard to say exactly what you're getting when you're, purchasing kind of an unregulated product. I see a couple questions about dispensaries. Are the sales personnel knowledgeable about the products? I would say they're probably knowledgeable about the products. Are they knowledgeable about the medical evidence and medical conditions and cautions? That is really depends on their own on the training that they have received. So I would say some of them may be and some of them may not be. And then are the dispensaries licensed? And the answer to that is yes. So in Virginia and Maryland and other states that have a legal program, the dispensaries are licensed, and everything that is sold in the dispensaries is typically the cannabis is grown in that state, the cannabis is processed in that state, and to various extents, depending on the state regulations, it is tested for. Tested for, to make sure that, what it says is on the label is really in there, to make sure that it doesn't have things like pesticides and heavy metals and things like that in it.
All right. Well, we're almost to 11 o'clock. So if anybody's got any last questions, now's the time.
I think there was one more question. I don't know that I heard the answer. Are dispensaries licensed?
Yeah, they are all licensed. If they are, legal dispensaries in the state, then they are licensed. And the
How do you tell
products
the
are
difference
highly regulated that are sold in those dispensaries.
How do you tell the difference? I mean, is everyone that's got a storefront licensed then, or are there some that are shams?
Um, I mean, I guess I couldn't say for sure. But just like, I mean, I would assume that if you go in and they don't have, just like you would walk into a restaurant and you would see evidence of their licensure, hanging on the wall. You should be
Ah,
seeing that in a dispensary as well. And if you don't, then I would ask for it. But probably most of the dispensaries that you would go into, yes, they're probably licensed. I'm gonna pop my email address here in the chat. Let's see. And you guys are welcome to email me if you have questions that come up. It's lsera@rx.umaryland, spell out maryland.edu.
Okay. Well, this was a very informative presentation. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And yeah, please feel free to reach out if you have questions. And I hope you all have a wonderful week.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.